Researchers are increasingly finding evidence that our world is simply filled with proof of the existence of a highly developed civilization in the past. But the history of the purpose of these devices on a macro scale has been deliberately distorted. They were given a religious cult or some other meaning, suggesting the primitiveness of those who built all of this. Let's take a look at the amphitheaters of Rome, which are considered ancient. Our version is that these are not amphitheaters at all, but rather power substations that concentrate and utilize solar energy. And what about everything we know regarding gladiator fights being held in the center of the amphitheaters? That's a blatant and baseless fabrication that was born in the minds of creative thinkers of the 18th century when the official history was being created. Theater in Pergamon, Greece. Who can assure the audience in the top rows that everything on stage will be seen and heard? This isn't an enclosed space with good sound insulation, a slight gust of wind, and because of the background noise, you might not be able to hear anything at all. And it's impossible to enjoy the show from such a height. It's a foolish structure from the perspective of the stage. But from an engineering point of view, the upper structure is infrastructure for servicing the concentrating and reflecting part of the technological construction, the components of which had to be placed on the steps. Below, in this rectangular structure, was the receiving part of the concentrated energy, and it was here that it was used to carry out a process, possibly melting or converting it into another form of energy. Here is the road where the material moved along the conveyor to the device below. Such a high placement of the technical complex was due either to the natural slope or for processing what was extracted here. The next example is Athens' Theater of Dionysus. Of course, here you could rely on the acoustics and you could hear something. It should be noted that the seating has been reconstructed, so that is, they were remodeled so that people could sit there. No matter what anyone says, this was all poured from concrete. Imagine how much concrete you need to pour to get an amphitheater like this. An engineer knows producing that much concrete requires multiple factories and a lot of construction and transportation equipment. The theater in Epidaurus, Greece. All these theaters have seating that forms only part of a circle. Wouldn't it be more logical to arrange the seats in a circle but closer to the stage? The Delphi Theater in Greece. These theaters are believed to be thousands of years old. In reality, concrete doesn't last that long. It starts to crumble after a few hundred years. These structures were all built between the 15th and 17th centuries. Another Greek theater. All these structures are not only in Greece but also in Turkey, and there are even some in North Africa. But what if we imagine these structures looking like this? Here we see a diagram of a solar power plant. The sun hits the reflective plates, focuses on the receiver has a heat exchanger, and then the heated liquid can be converted into electricity. So it's possible that these were solar boilers supplying the city with hot water. Currently, there are working modern equivalents. The Sun Complex. This insane engineering structure is located in the Parkin district in the foothills of the Tian Shan, about 45 kilometers from Tashkent, at an altitude of 1,050 meters. The engineering development of such a structure cost an absolutely insane amount of money and was only possible during the Soviet Union. But its operation is almost free of charge. The main parabolic mirror, measuring 54 by 54 meters, forms a focused beam with a diameter of 1.2 meters. In the center, behind the mirror's surface, there is a research center facility where the metal melting process is monitored. The heliostats operate in automatic mode. That is, by following the sun, they distribute the solar beams onto the main concentrator in such a way that the required temperature in the furnace is achieved, ranging from 800 to 3000 degrees. It's probably not a coincidence that the area of amphitheaters is comparable to this modern marvel. With its help you can heat water and melt metals and ores. Here's more proof that the sun can heat water even if you collect its radiation from a small area. The power of the sun's radiation at the Earth's surface when it's at the zenith is estimated to be about 1,350 watts per square meter. To get a power output of 10 kilowatts, you only need to collect sunlight from an area of just 7.5 square meters. In the mid-latitudes, at noon in summer, each square meter oriented perpendicular to the sun's rays receives a solar energy flow of about 1 kilowatt. Who remembers the story or legend of how Archimedes burned the Roman fleet that was about to attack Syracuse? He used a bronze hexagonal mirror made up of small rectangular mirrors. Each of them was mounted on hinges, so the angles of the mirrors could be adjusted so that the reflected sunlight was focused on a single point. According to another version, women of Syracuse helped Archimedes, who at his request stood up with polished copper dishes and directed sunlight onto the Roman ships. Today, knowing what technologies were used before in the 18th century, we can assume that at the core of this myth was a battle using energy, laser, or plasma weapons, and it's not a fact that the ships weren't flying. In every amphitheater there should be a column or a structure with that reservoir or crucible, which should be heated using mirrors installed on each tier. However, there's a problem. The sun's angle of incidence matches the angle of reflection from the mirrors, so as the sun moves, the focal point shifts and is lost. But if you consider that the focus was not on a single point, but on a certain area, then as the sun moved, some mirrors would work while others would take over. It's perfect for heating water. You don't need to evaporate it, and this mirror arrangement provides the exact heating needed. It was even possible to do this with the moving flow from the aqueduct. In other words, there was no need to make moving mirrors. And there is evidence for this. The stage of amphitheaters was very often a long line. It is quite possible that supports with tanks were installed in it, and the underground room of the stage served as technical rooms for liquid circulation. The huge amphitheater behind the stage has remains of a structure where the tanks might have been located. Many amphitheaters have this kind of structure, a semicircle of what seem to be seating areas, and behind the stage a vertical wall with arches and windows several stories high. This is where the radiation receivers and heating areas were located. Looking at the amphitheater, an engineer understands that the semicircular arrangement of the steps facing south collects the maximum amount of light from morning until evening. That means the spectators have to sit in the hottest sunlight at any time of the day. Meanwhile, artists draw seating that faces north and add canopies that protect from the sun. In some amphitheaters, restorers have to assemble seating from iron and wood because the concrete steps are not suitable for sitting at all. There are several dozen such amphitheaters known in Turkey, some of which are heavily damaged, and in Europe and Africa there are more than 200 known. Of course, people tend to trust official history, and we believe it until engineers get involved. They start asking uncomfortable questions, translating everything into the language of technology, numbers, and the costs required to produce it. Where is the sun often located? At the zenith. Round amphitheaters with maximum efficiency were also used. Well, since there are no steps here and it's impossible to add them because of the steepness, and it would be too expensive anyway, historians, as they usually do, simply walk around this amphitheater, so to speak. They avoid it. The Pula Amphitheater in Croatia. Notice that the seating, or what looks like seating, for such a structure is only on one side, even though it's round. On the other sides, it seems like they weren't even planned. There are no traces or remains of destruction. Of course, we can't rule out that possibility. There were also arenas and stages for gladiatorial fights and other performances, like this amphitheater. But there is a lot of evidence suggesting that most of the amphitheaters in these latitudes were actually thermal stations for heating water and smelting metal. It is possible that these structures were used for their technological purpose before the catastrophe, and after the collapse of the previous civilization, they were repurposed as industrial buildings as part of creating history. They held entertainment events there when all meaning was forgotten and the technology was deliberately lost. Now let's just look at these incredibly expensive and technologically advanced structures from a different perspective.